The discovery was made on a Tuesday morning in March of 1847. Traveling the rural roads of central Georgia, a cotton merchant from Savannah stopped to water his horse near a small plantation. The air was thick with humidity, unseasonably warm for early spring. Fog still clung to the low places in the fields, giving the landscape an almost dreamlike quality. Since dawn, Charles Dennison had been riding, eager to reach the next town before nightfall. His horse, a bay mare named Constance, had started favoring her left front leg about a mile back, and he decided not to push his luck. A perfect place to rest seemed to be the small creek running alongside the plantation property. He dismounted, led Constance to the water, and was checking her hoof when he heard the sound, a bell ringing out across the fields, the signal for the enslaved workers to begin their day. It was a sound Dennison had heard 1,000 times before on plantations across Georgia. Nothing was unusual about it, but what he saw when he looked up made him freeze mid-step. From their quarters, the workers were emerging. Positioned about 200 yards from the main house was a long wooden structure. They moved in that particular way enslaved people developed, efficient but not rushed, conserving energy for the long day ahead, avoiding any movement that might be interpreted as either laziness or insubordination. Among them were children. That wasn't unusual either. Often put to work in the fields were children as young as 5 or 6, starting with simple tasks like carrying water or picking up dropped cotton. But these children were different. Even from a distance, even through the morning fog, Dennison could see that their skin was pale, not the light brown of mixed ancestry common enough on plantations, but truly pale, almost translucent in the early morning light. As they moved into the fields and the sun began to burn away the fog, he could see more details. Hair ranged from light brown to almost blonde, features that were unmistakably European. Dennison counted them as they dispersed into the cotton rows, 12 children, ranging from what looked like 3 or 4 years old to early adolescence. Every single one had similar features, similar builds, the same distinctive eye color he could make out even at this distance, an unusual hazel green that caught the light. They looked like siblings. They looked like they all belonged to the same family. They did. An overseer appeared, a thick-set man carrying a long stick, not quite a whip, but close enough to serve as a threat. He barked orders, and the children moved faster, taking their positions in the fields alongside the adult workers. The older ones carried baskets. The younger ones followed behind, learning, being trained in the work that would consume their lives. Still holding his horse's hoof, Dennison stood there, trying to process what he was seeing. For 20 years, he'd been in the cotton trade. He'd visited dozens of plantations. He'd seen enough to understand how the system worked, even if he tried not to think too hard about the human cost involved in the bales of cotton that made him his living. But this was different. This was something that made his stomach turn in a way he couldn't quite explain. He released Constance's hoof, the mare was fine, just a small stone he'd already removed, and led her to a hitching post near the plantation entrance. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what he was seeing. By the standards of the larger operations, the plantation house itself was modest. 2 stories, white painted wood, a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, well maintained but not ostentatious. The house of a man who was comfortable but not wealthy, successful but not elite. As Dennison approached, a man emerged onto the porch. Dennison estimated he was in his early 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers, no jacket despite the morning chill. In his hand was a cup of coffee, steam rising from the rim. The man was watching the fields, watching the workers, watching the children, and on his face was an expression Dennison would later describe as satisfaction, the look of a man surveying his property, his possessions, his investments. "Morning," the man called out, his voice friendly, welcoming. "You look like you could use some coffee yourself. Come on up." For just a moment, Dennison hesitated, then climbed the steps to the porch. The man extended his hand. "Horace Crawford," he said. "This is my place. You're passing through, I assume." Charles Dennison, out of Savannah. Cotton merchant. My horse needed water, and I thought I might inquire about purchasing rights to your harvest if you haven't already contracted with another buyer." It was a lie, or at least partially so. Dennison had come this way hoping to establish new business contacts, but he hadn't planned to stop at this particular plantation. That had been pure chance, or perhaps something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fate. Crawford's face brightened. "Always happy to talk business. Come inside. My wife will prepare us a proper breakfast, and we can discuss terms." As Dennison followed Crawford into the house, he glanced back once more at the fields, at the children with their pale skin and European features working in the morning sun, at the overseer watching them with his stick in hand, at the nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight. Before we continue with the story of what Charles Dennison discovered that morning and the shocking investigation that followed, take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one, stories that reveal the darkest corners of American history. And let us know in the comments what state or city you are listening from. We love hearing from our audience across the country. Now, let's return to that plantation in Georgia, where nothing was quite what it seemed, and where Dennison was about to learn the full extent of what Horace Crawford had built. The interior of the Crawford house was exactly what Dennison expected, comfortable but not luxurious, furnished with pieces that spoke of established prosperity rather than new money. To the left was a parlor with a piano that looked like it was actually played, judging by the sheet music stacked on top. To the right was a dining room with a table that could seat 10, though Dennison suspected it rarely hosted that many guests. Decorating the walls were paintings of pastoral scenes, the kind of generic landscapes that merchants sold from catalogs. Nothing distinctive, nothing that revealed much about the people who lived here. Crawford led him into the dining room and called out toward the back of the house, "Margaret, we have a guest for breakfast." A woman appeared in the doorway leading to the kitchen, presumably Mrs. Crawford, though she looked younger than her husband by at least a decade. She was pretty in a faded way, with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a dress that was well-made but practical, not fashionable. Her expression was polite but distant, the look of someone who'd learned to wear a mask of pleasantness regardless of what she actually felt. "Mr. Dennison, a cotton merchant from Savannah," Crawford said. "Charles, my wife, Margaret." She nodded acknowledgement but didn't extend her hand or smile. "I'll have the girl bring coffee and biscuits," she said quietly, then disappeared back through the doorway. Crawford seemed not to notice his wife's coldness. He gestured for Dennison to sit at the table and took the chair at the head, the position of authority, even in this casual setting. "So, cotton merchant," Crawford said, "you've picked a good year to be in the business. Prices are holding steady and the crop's looking strong. I'm projecting a 20% increase over last year's yield." Dennison made appropriate noises of interest, but his mind was elsewhere. He was trying to figure out how to ask about the children without being obvious, without revealing his discomfort. In the social codes of the plantation South, a white man questioning another white man's treatment of his enslaved people was considered rude at best, suspicious at worst. But he didn't have to ask. Crawford brought it up himself. A young woman, enslaved, Dennison realized, though she wore a clean dress and an apron that indicated housework rather than fieldwork, brought in a tray with coffee, biscuits, butter, and jam. She moved silently, efficiently, keeping her eyes down. She couldn't have been more than 16 years old, and her skin was dark enough that she clearly hadn't been among the pale children Dennison had seen in the fields. As she poured coffee into their cups, Crawford spoke to her without looking at her. "Tell Rebecca to make sure the young ones get extra water today. It's going to be hot, and I don't want any of them getting sick." "Yes, sir," the girl murmured, finishing with the coffee and backing away toward the kitchen. Dennison saw his opening. The young ones. Crawford took a sip of coffee and smiled, that same smile Dennison had seen on the porch, the smile of satisfaction. "You noticed them, I assume?" "Hard not to. They stand out quite a bit." "I did notice," Dennison said carefully. "Quite a few children out there with unusual features." 17, actually, Crawford said, and there was something in his voice, pride, accomplishment. "Though 2 of them are too young for field work yet. The oldest is 13 now, named him Thomas. Strong boy, good worker. I expect he'll fetch a premium price when I sell him next year. The casual way Crawford said it, "when I sell him next year," made Denison's hand tighten on his coffee cup. He forced himself to maintain a neutral expression, to keep playing the role of interested merchant, nothing more. "That's quite a few children," he said. "Your workforce must be expanding rapidly." Crawford leaned back in his chair, and now the pride in his expression was unmistakable. "I've been implementing a breeding program," he said, using the same tone someone might use to discuss agricultural techniques or livestock management. "Started about 12 years ago, not long after I inherited this place from my father. The results have exceeded my expectations." Denison felt his stomach turn, but he forced himself to keep listening, to keep asking questions. He needed to understand the full extent of what was happening here. "A breeding program," he repeated, trying to sound curious rather than horrified. "Exactly. See, most plantation owners don't think strategically about reproduction. They leave it to chance, to a natural increase. Whatever happens, happens. But I realized there was an opportunity for deliberate improvement." Crawford warmed to his subject, speaking faster, more animated. "I select specific women, young, healthy, with certain physical characteristics. Light skin is a factor, but more important is bone structure, facial features, overall build. And then I ensure that the next generation carries the traits I want to emphasize." Denison understood what Crawford was saying, understood exactly what ensures meant, but he needed to hear it stated explicitly. "You're saying you father the children yourself?" "Of course," Crawford said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "That way, I control the bloodline completely. No uncertainty about parentage, no variables I can't account for. And the results speak for themselves. Those children you saw, every buyer who's seen them has been impressed. They pass for white in most contexts, which means they're valuable for housework, personal service, positions where appearance matters. I can get twice what I get for a darker field worker." He was describing his own children, 17 of them, as products, as investments, as things to be sold for maximum profit. Denison tried to imagine what that must be like, to grow up knowing your father viewed you as nothing more than property, as livestock to be bred and sold. The psychological horror of it was almost worse than the physical reality. "And the mothers?" Denison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "How do they respond to this arrangement?" For the first time, Crawford's expression shifted slightly, not to shame or regret, but to irritation, the way someone might react to an unexpected complication in an otherwise successful business venture. "Most accept it," he said. "They understand their position, understand that cooperation makes their lives easier. I'm not cruel, Mr. Denison. I don't beat them unnecessarily. I make sure they are fed adequately during pregnancy, that they have time to recover after birth, though not too much time, of course. Can't afford to have valuable workers idle. And if they don't accept it?" Denison pressed. Crawford's eyes hardened. "Then I make it clear that acceptance isn't optional. I own them, Mr. Denison. They don't have the luxury of refusal. This is my property, my plantation, my right as their master. The law is quite clear on that point." The brutality of the statement, delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, made Denison's vision blur for a moment with anger. But he couldn't show it. Not yet. Not until he knew more, until he had evidence, until he could figure out what, if anything, could be done about this. Margaret Crawford reappeared in the doorway, her face still expressionless. "Horace, you have a visitor. Mr. Bennett from town, about the feed order." Crawford stood, his businesslike demeanor returning immediately. "Excuse me for a moment, Mr. Denison. Help yourself to more coffee. I'll be right back to discuss the cotton purchase." As Crawford left the room, Denison sat in silence, trying to process everything he'd just heard, the casual admission of systematic rape, the cold calculation of breeding human beings for profit, the complete absence of shame or recognition that any of this might be wrong. He thought about those children in the fields, 17 of them. 17 lives created not out of love or even desire, but as a deliberate business strategy, growing up enslaved by their own father, knowing that when they reached a certain age, he would sell them away without hesitation. How many of them knew the truth? How many understood that the man who owned them was also the man who had fathered them? How did you live with that knowledge? Margaret Crawford was still standing in the doorway, watching him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Dennison saw something in her expression, a flash of something that might have been pain or anger or despair. Then it was gone, replaced by that same blank politeness. "More coffee, Mr. Dennison?" she asked quietly. "No, thank you," he managed to say. Then, taking a risk, "Mrs. Crawford, does the minister ever visit the plantation?" It was a coded question, a way of asking whether anyone from outside ever witnessed what happened here, whether there was any external oversight or accountability. Margaret's expression didn't change, but her hands, clasped in front of her apron, tightened slightly. "We attend services in town every Sunday," she said. "The Reverend considers my husband a pillar of the community, very generous with his donations." Of course he was. Men like Crawford always were. Generosity bought silence, bought complicity, bought the willingness of others to look away from uncomfortable truths. "I see," Dennison said. "Thank you for the coffee and hospitality." Margaret nodded once and disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Dennison alone with his thoughts and his growing horror at what he had discovered. When Crawford returned 15 minutes later, full of apologies for the interruption and ready to discuss cotton prices and delivery schedules, Dennison played along. He negotiated a preliminary agreement, promised to send formal contracts within the week, and made plans to visit again in the fall to inspect the harvest. He had no intention of keeping any of those promises, but he needed Crawford to believe that their interaction had been purely business, that Dennison had seen and heard nothing troubling, that everything was normal. As he rode away from the plantation an hour later, Constance moving at an easy walk beneath him, Dennison kept glancing back at the fields, at the children working in the sun, at the nightmare hiding behind a facade of southern gentility and economic prosperity. He couldn't stop thinking about one detail in particular. When Crawford had mentioned the oldest child, Thomas, age 13, he'd said he planned to sell him next year, which meant the boy had perhaps 12 more months with whatever family he'd known his entire life. 12 months before he was torn away, sold to strangers, shipped off to some other plantation, where he'd spend the rest of his life among people who had no connection to him, no knowledge of where he came from. And Crawford spoke about it the same way someone might discuss selling a horse or a piece of furniture. Charles Dennison had been born into a world where slavery was normal, where fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved labor, where white supremacy was so deeply embedded in the culture that most people never questioned it. He'd participated in that system his entire adult life, profiting from it, accepting it as the natural order of things. But this was different. This crossed some line that even his conditioned conscience couldn't ignore. This was something that demanded action, demanded response, demanded that he do something anything to stop it. The question was what, and who would help him? Savannah in 1847 was a city of contrasts. Elegant squares designed by James Oglethorpe a century earlier created pockets of ordered beauty amid the chaos of a booming port city. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees, giving the place an air of timeless gentility. But beneath that surface beauty was an economy built entirely on the labor of enslaved people and the cotton they produced. The city's docks were constantly busy with ships loading bales of cotton destined for textile mills in New England and England. Auction houses operated openly, selling human beings alongside furniture and livestock. Enslaved people moved through the streets, running errands for their masters, carrying goods, building the city's expanding infrastructure. Charles Dennison had an office in a building overlooking one of the main squares. From his window on the second floor, he could see the daily flow of commerce, the steady movement of capital and labor that made Savannah one of the wealthiest cities in the South. But when he returned from the Crawford plantation that Tuesday afternoon, he couldn't focus on the paperwork waiting on his desk. The ledgers that usually demanded his attention seemed meaningless. The cotton contracts that represented his livelihood felt like complicity in a system he was only now beginning to truly see. His clerk, a young man named Robert Parrish, noticed his distraction immediately. Everything all right, Mr. Dennison? You seem troubled. Dennison looked up from the contract he'd been staring at without reading for the past 20 minutes. Robert was 23, born in Savannah, son of a local lawyer, good with numbers, reliable, discreet. But could he be trusted with what Dennison had learned? Robert, may I ask you a question of a sensitive nature? The younger man sat up straighter, curious. Of course, sir. In your experience, in your observations of how plantations operate, have you ever heard of systematic breeding programs where the master deliberately fathers children with enslaved women as a business strategy? Robert's expression shifted from curiosity to discomfort. He glanced toward the door as if checking to make sure no one else was within earshot, then spoke quietly. I've heard rumors, he admitted. Never anything specific. Never anyone naming names. But there are stories, whispers about certain plantations where all the children look suspiciously similar to the owner. It's one of those things people know about but don't discuss in polite company. Why not? Because what would be the point? Robert's voice carried a note of resignation. The master owns the women. The law gives him absolute authority over his property, including their bodies, including any children they bear. There's no legal remedy, no crime being committed. So people ignore it, pretend they don't see it, and life goes on. That doesn't trouble you. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Of course it troubles me. I'm not a monster, Mr. Dennison. But I'm also not naive. I know how the world works. The entire economy of this region, our livelihoods, our wealth, our society, it's all built on the labor of enslaved people. Once you start questioning one aspect of the system, where do you stop? How do you participate in any of it with a clear conscience? It was the question Dennison had been asking himself all afternoon. Once you saw the system clearly, once you understood its full scope of cruelty, how did you continue to benefit from it? How did you sleep at night knowing your comfort was purchased with other people's suffering? He told Robert about the Crawford plantation, about the 17 children with their pale skin and European features, about Crawford's casual admission of his breeding program, his cold calculation of profit and loss, about the plan to sell Thomas, the oldest child, next year. Robert listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. What are you going to do? He asked when Dennison finished. I don't know, Dennison admitted. I was hoping you might have suggestions. You could report it to the authorities. And tell them what? That Crawford is fathering children with women he owns? That's not illegal. That Crawford is selling his own children? They're legally considered property, following the condition of the mother. There's no law being broken. Then maybe you need to think about changing the laws. That takes time, years, probably. In the meantime, Crawford continues what he's doing, and those children continue to suffer. Robert leaned back in his chair, thinking. There is one person in Savannah who might be able to help. Dr. William Preston. He's been practicing medicine here for 30 years. Treats patients on plantations all across the region. If anyone has seen the real conditions, the real costs of the system, it's him. And I've heard he has sympathies that not everyone in Savannah shares. It was a careful way of suggesting that Dr. Preston might be sympathetic to abolition, or at least critical of slavery's worst excesses. In Savannah in 1847, such views had to be expressed carefully, coded in ways that allowed for plausible deniability if questioned by the wrong people. Do you think he'd talk to me? Only one way to find out. His office is on Abercorn Street, 3 blocks from here. But Mr. Dennison, be careful. If you start making inquiries, asking too many questions, people will notice. And if Crawford finds out you're investigating him, there could be consequences. Men like that have friends, connections, power. They don't take kindly to outside interference. Dennison understood the warning. Understood the risk he was taking. But he also understood that doing nothing, returning to his normal life, and pretending he hadn't seen what he'd seen wasn't an option. Not anymore. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate your honesty. What do you want me to tell people if they ask where you are? Tell them I'm pursuing a new business opportunity. Which, in a way, I suppose I am. As Dennison left the office and walked through the streets of Savannah toward Dr. Preston's office, he noticed things he'd somehow managed to overlook for years. The auction house on the corner, where families were being separated and sold to different buyers. The scarred backs visible when enslaved workers bent to lift heavy loads. The careful expressions they wore, masks designed to hide whatever they actually felt, to show only what their masters wanted to see. How had he participated in this for so long without really seeing it? How had he been so willfully blind? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, came down to self-interest. It was easier not to look too closely, easier not to ask difficult questions, easier to accept the comfortable lies about natural hierarchies and civilizing influences and the burden of uplift. The truth was messy and disturbing and demanded actions that would risk his business, his social standing, his comfortable life. But he had looked, he'd seen, and now he couldn't pretend otherwise. Dr. William Preston's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building. A small sign beside the door read simply, *Preston, physician. The door was unlocked, and Dennison stepped into a waiting room that smelled of carbolic acid and something else, illness, perhaps, or just the accumulated suffering that any doctor's office inevitably absorbed. An older woman sat behind a desk sorting through papers. She looked up as Dennison entered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was hoping Dr. Preston might spare a few minutes." "It's a matter of some urgency. He's with a patient right now, but if you're willing to wait, I'll let him know you're here." "Your name?" "Charles Dennison." She wrote it down on a slip of paper and disappeared through an interior door. Dennison sat in one of the waiting room chairs and tried to organize his thoughts. What exactly was he going to say to the doctor? What did he hope to accomplish? He was still trying to figure that out when Dr. Preston appeared, the older woman beside him. William Preston looked to be in his early 60s, with a full head of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore spectacles that magnified his eyes slightly, giving him an owlish appearance. His clothes were well-made but practical, the outfit of a professional man who spent his days working rather than attending social functions. "Mr. Dennison," the doctor said, extending his hand. "Margaret tells me it's urgent." "Are you unwell?" "No, nothing like that. I need to speak with you about a professional matter. Plantation medicine, specifically." Something shifted in Preston's expression. Not alarm exactly, but a heightened attention. "Come into my office." "Margaret, please reschedule my 4 o'clock appointment. This may take some time." The doctor's office was exactly what Dennison expected. Shelves lined with medical books, a desk covered in papers and correspondence, anatomical diagrams on the walls, and the pervasive smell of various medicines and tinctures. Preston gestured for Dennison to sit in a chair facing the desk, then settled into his own seat with a slight grimace that suggested chronic back pain. "Now, Mr. Dennison, what brings you to my door?" Dennison took a breath and began the same story he'd told Robert. The Crawford plantation, the children with European features, Crawford's admission of his breeding program, the casual mention of selling his oldest son next year. Preston listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Dennison finished, the doctor was quiet for a long moment, staring at his desk as if gathering his thoughts. "You want to know if what Crawford is doing is illegal?" Preston finally said. "It wasn't a question. I want to know if there's any way to stop him." Preston stood, walked to a cabinet against the wall, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured generous amounts into both, handed one to Dennison, and drank deeply from his own before speaking again. "I've been practicing medicine in this region for 31 years, Preston said. "I've delivered hundreds of babies on plantations across Georgia. I've treated illnesses, injuries, complications from childbirth, wounds from punishments. I've seen things that would make a hardened soldier weep. And the Crawford situation, it's not even the worst I've encountered." The statement was delivered with such weariness, such resignation, that Dennison felt his hope beginning to fade. "But it is one of the most systematic," Preston continued. Crawford isn't acting out of impulse or passion or even simple abuse of power. He's implemented a calculated strategy, optimized for profit. That's what makes it particularly disturbing. The cold rationality of it. You've been to his plantation? Several times over the years. First call was in 1835, I believe. A difficult birth. Young woman named Mary, 17 years old. The baby survived. A girl, with skin light enough that I knew immediately who the father was. Crawford's eyes. Exactly. No mistaking it. Did you say anything to him? Preston laughed bitterly. Say what? Congratulate him on his daughter? Remind him that she's also his property, that he could sell her or work her or do whatever he pleased because the law gives him that right. I stitched up the woman, made sure the baby was breathing, collected my fee, and left. That's what I did. That's what I've always done. But you kept going back. He kept calling for me. Difficult births, complications, infections. I delivered 6 or 7 of those children myself, maybe more. Lost count after a while. Preston finished his whiskey and poured another. Do you know what the mortality rate is for enslaved women during childbirth, Mr. Dennison? About twice as high as it is for white women. Want to know why? Because they don't get adequate care before birth, they're forced back to work too soon after, and complications that would be treated seriously in a white patient get ignored until they become life-threatening. Is that what happened on the Crawford plantation? Preston's hand tightened on his glass. 3 women died on that plantation between 1835 and 1844. 3 that I know of. All of them within 2 weeks of giving birth. All of them because Crawford insisted they return to fieldwork before they'd properly recovered. I argued with him, tried to explain the medical risks, told him he was endangering their lives. He didn't care. Said he couldn't afford to have valuable workers idle. Said they were exaggerating their symptoms to get out of work. Said I was being too soft. That's murder, Dennison said quietly. Is it? Crawford would argue he was simply exercising his right to manage his property as he saw fit. That the women's deaths were unfortunate but not his fault, just the natural risks of childbirth. Any lawyer would raise reasonable doubt within minutes. Any jury of his peers, wealthy white men who owned slaves themselves, would acquit him without hesitation. Dennison felt his frustration rising. So there's nothing that can be done. No law, no authority, no justice available. I didn't say that. Preston leaned forward. I said a criminal prosecution would fail. But there are other approaches, other ways to apply pressure, to create consequences, to make Crawford's life difficult enough that he might reconsider his practices. What kind of approaches? Preston stood and walked to his bookshelf. Pulling down a worn leather journal. He flipped through pages covered in cramped handwriting, found what he was looking for, and turned the book toward Dennison. I keep records, Preston said. Notes on every patient I treat on plantations, not just medical details, but observations about conditions, treatment, outcomes. I've been doing it for years, building documentation of exactly what the system does to people. Someday, when the political climate changes, when there's finally a will to address these issues, this evidence might matter. Dennison scanned the page. It was a detailed account of a birth at the Crawford plantation, dates, patient name, complications, Crawford's refusal to allow adequate recovery time, the woman's subsequent death from infection, all written in precise medical terminology that would be difficult to refute or dismiss as hearsay. How many of these do you have? Hundreds. Maybe 1,000 pages by now. Multiple plantations, multiple owners, years of documentation. Preston closed the journal. But here's what matters for your purposes. I also have connections. Not the kind of connections that help in polite society, but the kind that might be useful for someone looking to challenge the system. People who help enslaved individuals escape to freedom. People who expose the worst abuses to northern newspapers. People who work in the shadows because that's the only place where justice is still possible. Dennison understood what Preston was suggesting. The Underground Railroad, abolitionist networks, activities that were not only illegal but could result in prison time, financial ruin, even violence if discovered. You're talking about breaking the law. I'm talking about following a higher law than the one written in Georgia's legal code. Preston met his eyes steadily. The question is whether you're ready to take that step. Because once you start down this path, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. You'll have made an enemy of Crawford and everyone like him. You'll have risked everything you've built. Are you prepared for that? Dennison thought about those children in the fields, about Thomas who had 12 months left before Crawford sold him away, about the mothers who died because Crawford valued cotton more than human life, about the systematic, calculated cruelty hiding behind a veneer of Southern gentility. Yes, he said. I'm prepared. Tell me what I need to do. What Charles Dennison was about to uncover would lead him into the darkest corners of Georgia's plantation system and into an underground network of resistance that risked everything to fight back. If you're as captivated by this true historical mystery as we are, hit that like button now and drop a comment telling us what you think should happen to Horace Crawford. Should he face justice, or does the system protect men like him? Let's find out together what Dennison discovered next, because the full extent of Crawford's operation was even more disturbing than anyone imagined. Dr. Preston didn't give Dennison specific names or locations. That would have been too dangerous, too easily traceable if anyone ever questioned Dennison about his activities. Instead, he gave him a series of carefully worded instructions that sounded innocent to anyone who might overhear but carried specific meaning to those who understood the code. There's a Quaker meeting house about 15 miles outside Savannah, Preston said. They gather for worship every Wednesday evening. If you were to attend, you might find people sympathetic to your concerns. Ask to speak with the elder who leads the service. Mention that you're interested in learning about their community's charitable work. Charitable work that was code for Underground Railroad activities, for the network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Will they trust me? Dennison asked. Not immediately. But if you're patient, if you demonstrate genuine commitment rather than just momentary outrage, they'll eventually bring you into their confidence. These people risk their lives regularly, Mr. Dennison. They're not going to involve someone who might betray them at the first sign of trouble. How long will it take to establish that trust? Weeks, possibly months. This isn't something that can be rushed. Preston paused. In the meantime, you should continue your investigation. Learn everything you can about Crawford's operation. Document it. Build a case. Even if the law won't act now, that evidence might be valuable in the future, and it will help the network understand what they're dealing with, what risks they'd be taking to intervene. Dennison nodded. What specifically should I be looking for? Financial records, if you can access them. How much Crawford paid for the mothers, how much he's received from selling the children. That establishes the profit motive, makes it clear this isn't just abuse, but calculated exploitation. Birth and death records, if they exist. Testimony from people who've witnessed conditions on the plantation, other doctors, merchants who've visited, even enslaved people from neighboring properties who might have information. And most importantly, find out where Crawford sells the children when they reach selling age. Who buys them? Where do they go? If we can establish a network of buyers who specifically purchase these light-skinned children, we might be able to apply pressure from multiple directions. It was a daunting list, the kind of investigation that would normally require official authority and legal resources. But Dennison had something else: motivation, connections in the merchant community, and the ability to travel throughout the region without raising suspicion. One more thing, Preston said as Dennison was preparing to leave. Be very careful. Crawford isn't stupid. If he suspects you're investigating him, if he thinks you pose a threat, he'll act to protect himself. These people have no qualms about violence when their interests are threatened. Document everything, but don't let him know what you're doing. That night, Dennison couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed in his comfortable Savannah townhouse, staring at the ceiling, thinking about those children. What were they doing right now? Sleeping in rough quarters, exhausted from a day of labor under the brutal sun. Did they dream of freedom? Or had they never known anything else, never imagined life beyond the boundaries of Crawford's property? He thought about Thomas, the 13-year-old boy Crawford planned to sell. Did Thomas know yet? Had Crawford told him, or would it be a surprise, men showing up one morning to take him away from everyone he'd ever known? How did you process that? The knowledge that your own father considered you property, worth less than the price of a good horse. Around 3 in the morning, Dennison gave up on sleep. He lit a lamp, found paper and ink, and began making notes, everything he remembered from his visit to the Crawford plantation. Every detail of his conversation with Crawford, every observation about the children, the property, the conditions. It wasn't much yet, just preliminary notes. But it was a start, the beginning of a record that would grow over the coming weeks and months into something substantial, something damning, something that might, if he was lucky, make a difference. The following Wednesday, Dennison attended the Quaker meeting house outside Savannah. It was a simple building, plain wood construction without the ornamentation that decorated most churches in the region. About 20 people were gathered inside when he arrived, sitting in silence on benches arranged in a square around an empty center space. The silence was unnerving at first. Dennison was used to church services with sermons, hymns, structured liturgy, but the Quakers simply sat, waiting for the Spirit to move someone to speak. Minutes passed with nothing but the sound of breathing and the occasional creak of the wooden benches. Then an older man stood. He was tall, thin, with a long beard and clothes that were well-made but deliberately simple. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily in the silent room. Friends, I've been thinking about the passage from Isaiah, learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. We are called to do more than merely believe in justice. We are called to act. It was a careful statement, one that could be interpreted as general religious encouragement or as something more specific, a reference to their illegal activities helping enslaved people escape. After the meeting ended, Dennison approached the older man who'd spoken. I'm new to the area, he said, using the script Preston had given him. I'm interested in learning about your community's charitable work. The man looked at him for a long moment, assessing. And why is that? Because I've recently become aware of suffering that I can no longer ignore. And I've been told your community takes that calling seriously. We do what we can where we can, as our conscience demands. The man extended his hand. I'm Nathan Garrett. Perhaps you'd like to stay for our fellowship meal. We can discuss our various efforts. The fellowship meal was held in a room adjacent to the meeting house. Simple food, bread and soup and vegetables, shared communally. About a dozen people stayed, and the conversation ranged across various topics, news from other Quaker communities, concerns about a drought affecting crops, discussions of scripture. But Dennison noticed something. Several times during the meal, Nathan Garrett would make references that seemed innocuous on the surface but carried deeper meaning to those who knew how to listen. A mention of traveling friends who needed assistance, a comment about goods that needed to be transported north, a question about whether anyone had room to host visitors in the coming weeks. It was all coded, all carefully worded to avoid explicit discussion of illegal activities, but the meaning was clear to anyone paying attention. After the meal, as people were cleaning up, Garrett approached Dennison again. Walk with me, he said quietly. They stepped outside into the warm Georgia evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Garrett led them away from the meeting house toward a small grove of trees where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. Dr. Preston sent word that you might be coming, Garrett said. He vouches for you, which counts for something. But trust has to be earned. Why don't you tell me exactly what you're looking for? Dennison told him about the Crawford plantation, about the 17 children, about Crawford's systematic breeding program. He described his conversation with Preston, his growing determination to do something about what he'd discovered. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression troubled but not surprised. We're aware of the Crawford situation, he finally said. We've been monitoring it for several years. The problem is access. The plantation is relatively isolated. Crawford keeps tight control over his workforce, and any attempt to help people escape would be extremely dangerous. We've helped a few individuals over the years, people who were being transported or who managed to run on their own and found their way to us. But a coordinated effort to remove multiple people from an active plantation, that's much more difficult. But not impossible. Not impossible. Just risky. We'd need detailed information about security, routines, when people are moved off the property. We'd need safe houses established along a route north, reliable conductors willing to take on a dangerous job. And we'd need to be absolutely certain that the people we're helping want to leave, understand the risks, and won't panic halfway through and reveal the network. How can I help establish that? Garrett studied him carefully. You're a merchant. You have a legitimate reason to visit plantations to conduct business. You could make regular visits to Crawford's property, observe conditions, learn routines, potentially make contact with the enslaved people there. Not directly. That would be too suspicious. But there are ways to leave messages, to establish communication. It's slow, careful work. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic. Just patient, methodical intelligence gathering. Are you willing to do that? It wasn't what Dennison had expected. He'd imagined something more immediate, more active. But he understood the necessity of caution. Moving too fast, being too obvious, would endanger everyone involved. Yes, he said. I'm willing. Then we'll teach you how to communicate safely, how to observe without being obvious, how to recognize people in the network, how to move goods, by which I mean human beings, without attracting attention. Garrett paused. But understand this, Mr. Dennison. Once you're involved, you're committed. You can't walk away if things get difficult or dangerous. Too many lives depend on discretion and reliability. If you're not absolutely certain you can maintain this commitment, tell me now, and we'll part as friends with no hard feelings. Dennison thought about his comfortable life in Savannah, his business, his social standing, his freedom to come and go as he pleased, everything he was risking by joining this network, everything he stood to lose if he was caught. But he also thought about those children, about Thomas with his 12 months of freedom left before Crawford sold him away, about all the people suffering in silence while men like Crawford profited from their exploitation. I'm certain, he said. Tell me what I need to do. Over the following weeks, Dennison became a student of the Underground Railroad network operating in Georgia. He learned that it was far more organized than he'd imagined, with established routes, safe houses, carefully vetted conductors, and sophisticated communication methods. Messages were passed through coded letters that looked like ordinary business correspondence. A letter mentioning 5 bales of premium cotton ready for transport actually meant 5 people ready to travel north. Expecting rain delays meant increased patrols or danger on a particular route. Prices remained favorable meant it was safe to proceed. Safe houses were maintained by people across the social spectrum, Quakers primarily, but also free black families, sympathetic white merchants, even a few slave owners who'd become disillusioned with the system. Each house knew only the locations immediately before and after their own position in the network, limiting the damage if anyone was captured and forced to reveal information. Conductors were the most valuable and most dangerous role. These were people who actually guided escapees from one safe house to the next, traveling at night, avoiding main roads, constantly alert for patrols or slave catchers. Most conductors were themselves formerly enslaved people who'd escaped north and then returned south repeatedly to help others. The risks they took were extraordinary. Dennison began making regular trips to the Crawford plantation, using the pretense of negotiating cotton purchase agreements. Each visit, he observed more details. He learned that Crawford employed 2 overseers, one for the fields, one for the house and grounds. He noticed that security was tightest at night but relaxed somewhat on Sundays when Crawford and his family attended church in town. He identified potential opportunities. Once a month, Crawford sent a wagon to town for supplies, usually accompanied by 2 or 3 enslaved people who did the loading. That represented a potential window, a time when people were off the plantation property and might be helped to disappear during the trip. But the challenge was making contact with the enslaved people themselves, communicating the possibility of escape without alerting Crawford or his overseers. That required patience and subtlety. He found his opportunity through a woman named Rebecca, the one who worked in the house serving meals. She was young, dark-skinned, and moved with the careful invisibility that enslaved people developed to avoid attention. But Denison had noticed something. When she served food, when she cleaned rooms, her eyes were always watching, always observing. She was intelligent, alert, and carefully hidden behind a mask of subservience. On his fourth visit to the plantation, while Crawford was occupied elsewhere, Denison deliberately left a folded piece of paper under his coffee cup. On it, he'd written a simple message in small, neat handwriting, *friends wait north. If you wish to travel, leave a blue ribbon on the fence post by the main road. It was dangerous. If the wrong person found the note, if Rebecca reported it to Crawford, Denison would be arrested immediately. But he had to take the risk. Without contact, without communication, all his planning was meaningless. 3 days later, when he rode past the Crawford plantation on another business trip, he saw it. A small piece of blue fabric tied to the fence post, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Rebecca had found the note. And she wanted to leave. Establishing communication with Rebecca was just the beginning. Denison needed to understand how many people might want to escape, whether they understood the risks, and whether they'd be able to maintain the discipline necessary for the journey north. He passed another message during his next visit, this time hidden inside a newspaper he left in the kitchen. The message was slightly more detailed, how many wish to travel? Can you move without being caught? The response came 2 weeks later, delivered through a free black man who worked as a carter transporting goods between plantations. The man had connections to the network, though Denison didn't learn his name. That kind of information was shared only on a need-to-know basis for everyone's protection. The message was written in barely legible handwriting, probably by someone who taught themselves to read and write in secret at great risk. But the meaning was clear, *6 of us could go. For mothers, 2 oldest children. Need help getting off property. Crawford watching close since last month. Someone tried to run and got caught. *6 people. It was more than Denison had hoped for initially, but also more complicated. Moving 6 people through Georgia, keeping them hidden, maintaining security, the risks multiplied with each additional person. He brought the message to Nathan Garrett at the next Wednesday meeting. 6 is a significant group, Garrett said, his expression troubled. We'd need to move them in stages, probably split them into smaller groups for the journey. And we'd need a very good opportunity to get them off the property without immediate pursuit. What kind of opportunity? Ideally, a situation where they're expected to be away from the plantation for a legitimate reason, which gives us hours or even a full day before Crawford realizes they're not coming back. The monthly supply run you mentioned might work, but we'd need more information. How many people usually go? How closely are they supervised? What's the route? Denison realized he needed to learn more, needed to be more systematic in his observations. He began making detailed notes after each visit, not just about security and routines, but about the people themselves, their names, their ages, their relationships to each other. He learned that among the 6 who wanted to escape were 2 women he'd heard Crawford mention, Louisa, who'd borne 3 of Crawford's children, and Hannah, who'd borne 5. Both were still relatively young. Louisa was 26, Hannah 31, but they looked older, worn down by years of forced childbearing and hard labor. The 2 children were Thomas, the 13-year-old boy Crawford planned to sell, and a 12-year-old girl named Ruth. Both had Crawford's distinctive eyes. Both had spent their entire lives knowing their father owned them. The other 2 women were younger, Abigail, 19 and pregnant, and Susan, 22, with 2 children still too young to travel. The dynamics were complex. Susan didn't want to leave her younger children behind, but she also couldn't take them on such a dangerous journey. Hannah wanted to help the younger women escape even if she couldn't go herself. Thomas was determined to leave before Crawford sold him, but worried about his younger siblings. It was exactly the kind of complicated, emotionally fraught situation that made Underground Railroad work so difficult. These weren't just bodies to be transported from point A to point B. They were people with relationships, obligations, fears, hopes. And any plan had to account for all of that. Dennison spent hours with Garrett and other members of the network, working through scenarios, identifying problems, trying to find solutions. They brought in a conductor named Benjamin, a tall, quiet black man in his 40s who'd made the journey north and back 17 times, to assess the feasibility. Benjamin's first question was blunt.
Are they prepared to never see their families again?
Because that's what this means. Once they leave, they can never come back. Anyone left behind, they won't see them again in this life.
Are they ready for that?
It was the hardest question, the one that made many potential escapees decide to stay despite terrible conditions. The system counted on those emotional bonds, on people being unwilling to abandon family even to save themselves. I think they understand, Dennison said. But I'm not sure. I haven't been able to speak with them directly. Then that needs to be your next step, Benjamin said. Before we commit to this, before we risk conductors and safe houses, you need to make absolutely certain these people are committed. Because if someone panics halfway through, if someone decides they made a mistake and wants to go back, they endanger everyone. I've seen it happen. I've seen entire networks exposed because one person couldn't handle the pressure. It was a reasonable concern, one that Dennison hadn't fully considered. He'd been focused on logistics and planning, but the human element, the psychological readiness, was just as crucial. How do I assess that without being obvious? You find a way to meet with them privately. Not on the plantation, Crawford would notice. But somewhere neutral, somewhere you can have an honest conversation. Benjamin thought for a moment. The monthly supply run. If you could arrange to be in town on the same day, if you could create a situation where you're alone with them for even a few minutes, that might be enough. It was risky. But everything about this plan was risky. Dennison agreed to try. The next supply run was scheduled for the first week of June. Dennison arranged to be in town that day, ostensibly conducting business with various merchants but actually waiting for the wagon from Crawford's plantation. It arrived mid-morning, driven by one of Crawford's overseers, a thick-set man named Polk, who had a reputation for cruelty. With him were 3 enslaved people, Rebecca, who Dennison had been communicating with, a man named Daniel, and Thomas, the 13-year-old boy. They spent 2 hours loading supplies, sacks of flour and cornmeal, barrels of salt pork, tools, fabric, medicines. Dennison watched from across the street, waiting for an opportunity. It came when Polk went into a tavern, leaving the 3 people to finish the loading. Dennison crossed the street quickly, approaching the wagon as if he were just another merchant checking on his own goods. "Rebecca," he said quietly, not looking directly at her. "The blue ribbon message. I need to know if you and the others understand what you're committing to." She continued working, but her voice was steady. "We understand. We know we can never come back. We know the risks."
"Are all 6 of you certain?"
"Because if anyone has doubts, if anyone might change their minds during the journey, it's better to know now." Thomas, loading a barrel onto the wagon, spoke without turning around. "We're certain. Crawford's selling me next month." He moved up the date. "If we don't go soon, I won't get another chance." Next month. That changed everything. They'd been planning to wait until July, when conditions might be more favorable. But if Thomas was being sold in June, they'd have to move faster. "Can you be ready in 2 weeks?" Dennison asked. "We can be ready tomorrow," Rebecca said. "We've been ready for years. Just tell us when and how." Dennison quickly explained the basic outline of the plan. On the next supply run, they'd arrange for Polk to be delayed, possibly arrested on some minor charge that would be dropped later but would keep him occupied for several hours. During that window, the 6 escapees would be moved to a safe house in town, hidden, and then transported north that night. "There are safe houses all the way to Ohio," Dennison said. "People who will hide you, feed you, keep you safe. But you have to trust them, follow their instructions exactly, and never panic no matter what happens. Can you do that?" Yes, Rebecca said simply. Thomas nodded without speaking. What about the others? Louisa, Hannah, Abigail, Susan. They're ready. Susan decided not to come. Can't leave her babies. But she'll help the rest of us get away. She'll cover for us. Give us time. It was exactly what Dennison needed to hear. They were committed. They understood the plan, and they'd thought through the sacrifices required. Polk emerged from the tavern, wiping his mouth and looking irritated. Dennison moved away casually, as if he'd just been inspecting the wagon's load, and disappeared into the crowd. *2 weeks. They had 2 weeks to finalize every detail, to position conductors and prepare safe houses, to arrange for Polk's convenient delay. 2 weeks to make the difference between freedom and a lifetime of slavery for 6 human beings. The plan was set in motion, and Charles Dennison found himself at the center of the most dangerous thing he'd ever attempted. The web of secrets was about to be tested, and any mistake could mean disaster for everyone involved. If you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, smash that like button and leave a comment with your prediction. Will they make it to freedom, or will Crawford discover the plan before they can escape? Subscribe and hit the notification bell because this story gets even more intense. Let's continue and find out what happened when everything finally came together. The 2 weeks before the escape attempt were the longest of Dennison's life. Every detail had to be perfect. Every contingency had to be planned for. And all of it had to be done quietly, without arousing suspicion. Nathan Garrett coordinated the safe houses. They'd need 7 stations between Georgia and Ohio. Each one a place where the escapees could hide during daylight hours, rest, eat, and prepare for the next leg of the journey. Some were maintained by Quakers, others by free black families, one by a white merchant who'd lost his own daughter to slave traders after she'd been kidnapped and falsely accused of being escaped property. Benjamin, the experienced conductor, would lead the first leg of the journey personally, guiding them from Savannah to a safe house about 40 miles north. From there, other conductors would take over in stages, each one responsible for a specific section of the route. The plan for getting them off Crawford's property evolved through several iterations. They considered having them escape at night, but that would trigger immediate pursuit. They considered staging an accident that would require medical attention in town, but that was too unpredictable. The supply run remained the best option, but they needed Polk to be delayed long enough that the escapees could disappear before anyone started looking for them. The solution came from an unexpected source, a local sheriff's deputy named Marcus Reed, who had his own reasons for disliking Crawford. Reed's sister had worked as a governess for a wealthy family in the region and had witnessed Crawford's treatment of the women on his plantation. The experience had disturbed her enough that she'd eventually quit her position and moved to Charleston, but not before telling her brother what she'd seen. Reed couldn't arrest Crawford, the man hadn't broken any laws, but he could help delay Polk on the day of the supply run by conducting a very thorough inspection of the wagon, looking for contraband or stolen goods. It was a weak pretext, but it would buy the necessary time. "I can give you 2 hours," Reed said when Dennison met with him privately. "Maybe 3 if I really drag out the inspection and then have to file paperwork. But after that, Crawford will start asking questions, and I'll have to let Polk go." 2 hours should be enough, Dennison said. "By the time Polk realizes people are missing, they'll be well hidden. And if Crawford suspects I helped them escape, he'll have no proof. You were just doing your job, conducting a routine inspection. Anything that happened after that isn't your responsibility." Reed didn't look entirely convinced, but he agreed to the plan. Like everyone else involved, he was taking significant risk for the sake of people he'd never met, people he had no obligation to help beyond the basic human recognition that what was happening to them was wrong. Dennison marveled at that, at the courage of ordinary people willing to break the law, risk their livelihoods, potentially face imprisonment, all because their conscience demanded it. It challenged his previous assumptions about morality and self-interest, about what people would do when pushed to make real choices rather than just express abstract principles. He also had to prepare his own affairs in case something went wrong. He drafted a letter to his clerk, Robert, to be opened only if Dennison was arrested, explaining what he'd been doing and why. He made arrangements for his business to be sold if necessary, with proceeds going to support Underground Railroad activities. He wrote a will leaving everything to his brother in Boston, with specific instructions that none of it should go to anyone still involved in the slave trade. Margaret, his housekeeper, a free black woman who'd worked for him for years, noticed his preparations and confronted him one evening. "You're planning something dangerous," she said. It wasn't a question. Dennison considered lying but decided she deserved the truth. He told her about Crawford, about the escape plan, about the risks involved. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My mother was born enslaved," she finally said. "She escaped when I was 3 years old. Brought me with her. We traveled for 6 weeks, hiding during the day, moving at night, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. There were people who helped us. White people, black people, people who had no reason to help except that they believed slavery was evil. Without them, I'd still be someone's property. Or more likely, I'd be dead. So, whatever you're doing, whatever risk you're taking, you're doing the right thing. And if there's any way I can help, you let me know." It was more than Dennison had expected, more than he dared hope for. He asked if she knew anyone in Savannah who might be willing to house the escapees for a few hours between when they left the supply wagon and when they could be moved to the first official safe house. "I know several people," Margaret said. "I'll make arrangements. You just get them to town safely." Everything was coming together. The plan was as solid as they could make it. The date was set, June 14, 1847. The next supply run, the day when 6 people would risk everything for a chance at freedom. Dennison visited the Crawford plantation one final time 3 days before the escape attempt. He needed to confirm that nothing had changed, that Crawford wasn't suspicious, that the 6 escapees were still committed and ready. The visit was tense. Crawford seemed distracted, irritable. At one point, he mentioned that one of his enslaved workers had been caught trying to smuggle a letter off the property. Had to make an example, Crawford said casually. 20 lashes. Can't allow that kind of behavior. Let one person get away with secret communications, and soon everyone's doing it. Dennison felt his stomach drop. Had Rebecca been caught? Had their plan been exposed? But Crawford continued talking about cotton prices and didn't mention Rebecca specifically. When she served coffee later that afternoon, Dennison saw no signs of injury, no indication that she'd been the one caught. Still, the incident was a reminder of how dangerous this was, how quickly everything could go wrong. As he was leaving, Dennison managed to pass one final message to Rebecca. Just 2 words written on a slip of paper tucked under a plate, asterisk still ready, asterisk he received his answer the next day when he rode past the plantation. The blue ribbon was back on the fence post, exactly where it had been the first time. They were ready. Now all they could do was execute the plan and hope that luck was on their side. June 14, 1847, dawned hot and humid, the kind of day that made even simple movement exhausting. Dennison was awake before sunrise, reviewing the plan one more time, checking every detail. The supply wagon would leave Crawford's plantation around 8 a.m., arriving in Savannah by 10:30 or 11 o'clock. Deputy Reed would intercept them shortly after arrival, beginning his inspection and holding poke until at least 1 p.m. During that window, the 6 escapees would be moved to Margaret's friend's house, a free black woman named Catherine who lived on the outskirts of town. They'd hide there until nightfall, then be transferred to the first official safe house by 10 p.m. Benjamin would meet them there, and the journey north would begin. Simple in theory, terrifyingly complex in execution. Dennison positioned himself near the town square, where he could observe the supply wagon's arrival without being obvious. He pretended to be reviewing paperwork, conducting business with merchants, just another day for a cotton trader. The wagon appeared at 10:47 a.m. Polk was driving, looking bored and irritable in the heat. On the wagon were Rebecca, Thomas, Daniel, and Dennison counted carefully, 3 other people he hadn't seen before. 6 people total. All the escapees were on the wagon. That simplified things considerably. Deputy Reed appeared almost immediately, walking up to the wagon with the official bearing of someone conducting routine business. "Need to inspect your cargo," Reed said loudly enough for Dennison to hear. "New regulations about transporting goods into the city. You'll need to unload everything for examination." Polk's protest carried across the square. "This is ridiculous. We make this run every month and never. You can file a complaint with the sheriff if you'd like," Reed interrupted. "After I complete my inspection. Now, start unloading." The performance was perfect. Reed managed to sound both bureaucratic and slightly apologetic, the classic stance of someone just doing their job, even though they agreed it was probably unnecessary. Polk started unloading the wagon, grumbling constantly. The 6 enslaved people helped, moving goods into neat stacks that Reed examined with exaggerated thoroughness. Dennison watched, forcing himself to breathe normally, to not show any signs of the nervous tension gripping his chest. An hour passed. Reed was dragging out the inspection beautifully, finding minor issues with packaging, requiring documentation that Polk didn't have, suggesting they might need to hold the entire shipment pending verification. At 12:15, Polk finally snapped. "I need to find a privy," he told Reed. "You keep inspecting. They'll help you." He gestured at the 6 enslaved people and stalked off toward the nearest tavern. It was the moment they'd been waiting for. As soon as Polk was out of sight, a wagon appeared, seemingly just another vehicle making deliveries, driven by a black man Dennison didn't recognize but who must have been part of the network. The wagon pulled up next to Reed's inspection site. In less than 3 minutes, with practiced efficiency, the 6 escapees climbed into the back of the new wagon, hidden under canvas and empty crates. The driver didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Reed or Dennison, just snapped the reins and moved away at a normal pace, not hurried, not drawing attention. Reed resumed his inspection as if nothing had happened. When Polk returned 20 minutes later, Reed was examining a barrel of salt pork with great concentration. "This packaging doesn't meet current standards," Reed said. "Seriously? I'm going to have to file a report. You and your workers can reload the approved items. But this barrel will need to stay here pending review." Polk's face was red with anger, but he started reloading. It wasn't until everything was back on the wagon that he looked around and seemed to notice something was wrong. "Where are they?" he asked, confusion replacing anger. "Where are who?" Reed replied innocently. "The workers. There were 6 of them." Reed looked around as if just noticing their absence. "I assume they went with you. They're your responsibility, not mine." Polk's expression shifted from confusion to panic. He started searching the immediate area, calling names, asking merchants if they'd seen 6 people matching their descriptions. By the time he gave up and climbed back on his wagon to race back to Crawford's plantation, it was nearly 2 p.m. The escapees had been hidden for almost 2 hours. They had maybe 4 more hours before Crawford organized a serious search party. And by then, they needed to be well on their way north. Catherine's house was small, modest, tucked away on a narrow street where few white people ventured. She'd cleared space in her cellar, a cramped, humid space that smelled of earth and old vegetables, but it was hidden and secure. Dennison visited briefly around 3 p.m., carrying a basket that ostensibly held supplies he was delivering for Margaret. Inside the basket was food, water, and a message about the next stage of the journey. Catherine let him in without speaking, led him to the cellar door. He descended carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The 6 escapees were huddled together in the corner, looking exhausted and terrified and hopeful all at once. When they saw Dennison, Rebecca started to cry, not tears of sadness, but of relief, of disbelief that the first part of the plan had actually worked. "You're safe for now," Dennison said quietly. "But Crawford will be searching soon. You need to stay absolutely silent. Make no noise that could attract attention. At nightfall, a man named Benjamin will come to take you to the next safe house. He's experienced, trustworthy. Do exactly what he says, and you'll make it to freedom." Thomas, the 13-year-old boy, spoke for the first time. "Is it real? Ohio? Freedom?" Or is it just another place where someone will own us? It's real, Dennison assured him. In Ohio, you'll be free. Not property, not enslaved. Free to work for wages, to make your own decisions, to build your own lives. It's real, and you're going to make it there. He distributed the food and water, made sure they understood the timeline, then left quickly. The less time he spent at the house, the less chance of anyone noticing and becoming suspicious. Back at his own home, Dennison tried to work, to distract himself, but it was impossible to focus. Every sound made him jump. Every knock at the door made him fear it was Crawford or the sheriff coming to arrest him. Margaret noticed his agitation. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. "Whatever happens now, you did the right thing." Dennison hoped she was correct. Crawford discovered the escape around 3:30 p.m. when Polk returned to the plantation and reported that 6 workers had vanished in Savannah. The plantation owner's reaction was exactly what everyone had feared: immediate, furious, and determined. He rode directly to the sheriff's office in Savannah, demanding action, threatening lawsuits, insisting on immediate pursuit. The sheriff, who was friendly with Crawford but also aware of Deputy Reed's inspection, tried to calm him down. "We'll investigate," the sheriff promised. "Put out notices, alert patrols. But you have to understand, if they got a few hours head start, they could be anywhere. We'll do our best, but I can't guarantee we'll find them." Crawford wasn't satisfied. He hired 4 slave catchers, professional bounty hunters who specialized in tracking and capturing escapees. These men were notorious for their brutality, their willingness to use violence, their success rate. They began their search immediately, questioning people in Savannah, looking for anyone who'd seen 6 people matching the escapees' descriptions. They visited the docks, thinking the escapees might try to board a ship. They checked the roads leading north, looking for tracks or signs of passage. But the Underground Railroad network had been operating in Georgia for years. They knew how to hide people, how to mislead searchers, how to create false trails that led nowhere. By the time darkness fell and Benjamin came to collect the escapees from Catherine's cellar, the slave catchers were 20 miles away, following a deliberately planted rumor that someone had seen a group matching the description heading west toward Alabama. Benjamin loaded the 6 people into a covered wagon designed to look like a typical merchant's transport. Hidden compartments beneath false floors provided cramped but effective concealment. Unless someone specifically knew what to look for, the wagon appeared to be carrying nothing but ordinary goods. The route north took them through back roads and small towns where the network had established relationships. At each stop, they'd transfer to a different conductor, a different vehicle, sometimes traveling by wagon, sometimes on foot, once by boat along a river that formed part of the route. The journey was grueling. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during daylight hours in barns, cellars, attics, anywhere that offered concealment. They endured days of hunger when safe houses were too risky to approach. They suffered through rainstorms, heat, exhaustion, the constant terror of being discovered. But they kept moving north, through Georgia, through Tennessee, through Kentucky. Each mile was a mile closer to freedom, a mile farther from Crawford's reach. Dennison received coded updates through the network. Asterisk goods proceeding as planned. Package reached 3rd station. Delivery expected on schedule. Asterisk it took 18 days to reach Ohio. 18 days of constant movement, constant fear, constant hope. On July 2, 1847, 6 people who'd been enslaved their entire lives crossed into free territory. They stood on Ohio's soil, legally beyond Crawford's reach, and for the first time in their lives, they were free. Benjamin sent word back to Georgia, asterisk delivery complete. All packages safely arrived. Asterisk when Dennison received the message, he wept. Not just with relief, though that was part of it, but with something else, a recognition of what had been accomplished, of the courage of everyone involved, of the reality that the system asterisk could asterisk be challenged, that justice was possible even when the law failed. 6 lives saved. 6 people who would never again be someone's property. It wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the suffering of everyone still enslaved. Couldn't bring back the mothers who died on Crawford's plantation. couldn't erase the childhood trauma of growing up owned by your own father. But it was *something*. It was proof that resistance was possible. That individual actions could make a difference. That moral courage still mattered in a world that often seemed determined to crush it. 6 people made it to freedom. But the consequences were far from over. Crawford's reaction to the escape would be brutal, and the investigation into who helped them would threaten everyone involved. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling us what you think happened next. Did Crawford discover who helped them escape? And what about all the people left behind on his plantation? Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because what happened next would expose Crawford's crimes to the entire nation. Let's continue with this powerful true story. Crawford's rage at losing 6 of his enslaved workers, including his oldest child, the boy he'd planned to sell for significant profit, was spectacular and terrible. The people remaining on his plantation bore the brunt of his fury. He increased security dramatically, hired additional overseers, instituted harsher punishments for minor infractions. He interrogated everyone, trying to find out if anyone had helped the escapees, if anyone had known about the plan. Susan, the woman who'd decided not to escape because she couldn't leave her young children, was subjected to particularly brutal questioning. Crawford suspected she knew something, suspected she might have helped the others. When she maintained she knew nothing, he didn't believe her. She was sold 2 weeks later, separated from her children, sent to a plantation in Alabama. It was punishment, pure and simple, Crawford's way of making an example, of showing what happened to anyone he suspected of disloyalty. 3 other enslaved people were sold in the following month, families torn apart, people shipped to different states. Crawford didn't need evidence of wrongdoing. Suspicion was enough. Fear was the tool he used to maintain control, and he wielded it without mercy. But Crawford's problems were only beginning. The 6 escapees reached settlements in Ohio, where abolitionists helped them establish new lives. And those abolitionists recognized the propaganda value of their stories. Within weeks, Louisa and Hannah were being interviewed by abolitionist newspapers across the North. They told their stories in detail, how Crawford had systematically impregnated them, how he'd fathered 17 children and treated them all as property, how mothers had died from being forced back to work too soon after childbirth. The accounts were published in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Ohio. They were reprinted in pamphlets, cited in speeches, used as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of the entire slave system. The Georgia breeder became a shorthand reference in abolitionist circles. Crawford's name, synonymous with the worst excesses of plantation slavery. His face was caricatured in political cartoons. His actions were denounced from pulpits and lecture halls across the North. At first, Crawford tried to fight back. He published denials in Georgia newspapers, claiming the women were lying, insisting he'd always treated his enslaved workers humanely according to the customs of the region. He threatened lawsuits against Northern publications for defamation. But the details were too specific, too well documented to be easily dismissed. Dr. Preston, emboldened by the publicity, provided copies of his medical records to abolitionist organizations, confirming the births, the deaths, the timeline that Louisa and Hannah described. Other witnesses came forward, merchants who'd visited the plantation, neighboring plantation owners who'd observed Crawford's practices. Even Margaret Crawford, his wife, gave a statement through her lawyer, expressing her disgust at her husband's actions and requesting a legal separation. The social consequences were severe. Crawford found himself ostracized in Georgia society. His church asked him to stop attending services. Business partners began distancing themselves. The careful social networks that plantation owners relied on began excluding him. By September of 1847, Crawford's reputation was in ruins. He was still wealthy, still owned his plantation and the people enslaved there, but he'd been transformed from respected member of the community to pariah, his name a byword for cruelty and moral corruption. Theodore Walsh, the district attorney Denison had met with months earlier, saw an opportunity. With public attention focused on the case, with Crawford's reputation destroyed, Walsh brought forward new legislation addressing exploitation of enslaved women. The legislation was modest, full of loopholes, carefully worded to avoid challenging the fundamental legality of slavery. But it required documentation of all births on plantations, mandated basic medical care for enslaved women before and after childbirth, created penalties for deliberate negligence that resulted in death. It was the barest minimum, a tiny step that did almost nothing to address the systemic brutality of the institution. But in the context of Georgia in 1847, even that tiny step represented a significant shift, an acknowledgement that even within the framework of slavery, there were limits to what society would tolerate. The legislation passed in November, opposed by many plantation owners but supported by enough moderate voices that it became law. It was named, unofficially, the Crawford Act, a permanent reminder of the man whose actions had made it necessary. For Denison, the months following the escape were nerve-wracking. Crawford's slave catchers investigated everyone who'd been in Savannah the day of the escape, everyone who might have helped. Denison was questioned twice, but his role as a cotton merchant gave him plausible reasons for being in town, and he'd been careful not to be seen directly interacting with the escapees. Deputy Reed also faced scrutiny, but his story held up. He'd been conducting a routine inspection, nothing more. If people had wandered away during that time, that wasn't his responsibility. The network remained hidden. None of the safe houses were exposed. None of the conductors were identified. The Underground Railroad continued its work, helping dozens more people escape. Over the following years, Denison continued his involvement, though more carefully now. He provided financial support, helped identify opportunities for escapes, served as a liaison between the network and people willing to help. He never again participated directly in an escape, but he remained committed to the cause. He also continued building his case against Crawford, documenting the plantation owners' activities, collecting testimony, preserving evidence. He didn't know if it would ever be useful, but he felt compelled to create a record to make sure that someday, when people look back on this period, they would understand what had happened, who had been responsible, what the true costs had been. Crawford never recovered his reputation. He continued operating his plantation until 1851, but the profitability declined as he struggled to maintain workforce numbers and faced increasing difficulty conducting business with his ostracized status. In May of 1851, he sold the property at a significant loss and moved to Texas, where he hoped to start over with less scrutiny. Whether he continued his breeding program there, Denison never learned. The networks in Texas were less developed, communications more difficult, information scarcer. But Crawford had left a legacy in Georgia, 17 children who bore his features, his eyes, his genes. Those who remained enslaved on the plantation were sold along with the property. Some ended up on other Georgia plantations. Others were transported to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, scattered across the South. Their fates varied. Some remained enslaved until the Civil War freed them in 1865. Others were sold north before the war and gained freedom earlier. A few escaped through the Underground Railroad network that Denison continued to support. Thomas, the 13-year-old boy who'd been the first to commit to the escape, grew up in Ohio. He learned to read and write, worked as a carpenter, married a woman he'd met in the free black community there. He had 4 children, and he made sure every one of them knew their history, knew where they'd come from, knew the price that had been paid for their freedom. Ruth, his sister, became a teacher in a school for black children. She wrote about her experiences growing up enslaved by her own father, trying to help others understand the psychological complexity of that situation, the ways it damaged people in ways that went beyond physical suffering. Louisa, one of the mothers who escaped, struggled at first in Ohio. The trauma of what she'd experienced, combined with the grief of leaving 3 children behind, left her deeply depressed. But slowly, with support from the community, she began to heal. She remarried, had 2 more children, children who would grow up free, children who would never know slavery. Hannah, who'd borne 5 of Crawford's children, became involved in the abolitionist movement. She traveled across the North giving speeches about her experiences, raising money for Underground Railroad activities, helping other escapees adjust to freedom. Her testimony was powerful, personal, impossible to dismiss or ignore. Abigail gave birth to her child, a son, 3 months after reaching Ohio. She named him Charles, after the merchant who'd risked everything to help her escape. Years later, she wrote Dennison a letter thanking him, telling him that her son was healthy and free, that he would grow up with opportunities she'd never dreamed possible. The letter was one of Dennison's most treasured possessions. He kept it in his desk drawer, took it out and reread it whenever he felt discouraged, whenever he questioned whether his actions had made any real difference. Dr. Preston continued his work for another decade. His medical journal documenting the conditions on Georgia plantations grew to over 1,000 pages. He never published it during his lifetime, too dangerous, too potentially destructive to too many people, including himself. But he preserved it carefully, left instructions for it to be donated to a historical society after his death. The journal was finally published in 1869, for years after the Civil War ended, as part of a collection of first-person accounts documenting the reality of slavery. It became an important historical source, cited by historians and researchers trying to understand the lived experience of enslaved people and the medical costs of the system. Nathan Garrett and the Quaker Network continued their work throughout the 1850s. They helped hundreds of people escape from Georgia and surrounding states, never publicizing their activities, never seeking recognition, simply doing what their conscience demanded. Garrett died in 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation, before he could see the system he'd fought against finally begin to crumble. But he died knowing he'd made a difference, that he'd saved lives, that his courage had mattered. Benjamin, the conductor who'd led the first leg of the 6 escapees' journey north, made the trip 17 more times before the war started. In 1863, he joined the Union Army, serving as a scout, using his knowledge of Georgia's back roads and safe houses to help Union forces navigate through the state. He survived the war and lived until 1894, dying at the age of 73, a free man in a country that had finally abolished the institution he'd spent decades fighting. Charles Dennison lived until 1873. He never married, never had children of his own, but he maintained connections with the people he'd helped escape, with their children and grandchildren, with a network of formerly enslaved people and abolitionists who'd become his true family. Before his death, he wrote a detailed account of the Crawford case, the discovery, the investigation, the escape, the aftermath. He included copies of letters, financial records, testimony, everything he'd collected over the years. He donated it all to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it still resides, a primary source for historians studying the Underground Railroad and plantation slavery in Georgia. His account was published posthumously in 1875, 2 years after his death, as part of a collection of Underground Railroad narratives. It provided valuable details about how the network operated, how individual moral courage could challenge systemic injustice, how ordinary people had risked everything to fight slavery. The children Crawford had fathered, those 17 lives he'd created as property, as investments, as commodities. Most of them survived too. See Emancipation in 1865. A few had already died by then, claimed by disease or accident or the general brutality of enslaved life. But the majority lived to experience freedom, to build lives as autonomous human beings rather than someone's property. One of them, a woman named Martha who'd been born on the plantation in 1846, wrote an autobiography in 1891. It was a slim volume, barely 100 pages, published by a small press that specialized in formerly enslaved people's narratives. The book was titled *Owned by My Father, A Childhood in Georgia Star. It was stark, unsentimental, filled with details about daily life on the Crawford plantation, about the psychological complexity of being enslaved by your own parent. The most powerful passage came near the end. People ask me if I hated him. I tell them hate is too simple a word for what I felt. He was my father. He was my owner. He gave me life. He stole my childhood. He made sure I had enough to eat because I was valuable property. He sold my older brother when I was 7 years old. How do you hate someone who exists in all those roles at once? I spent 18 years enslaved by my father trying to understand what I was to him. A daughter? A slave? An investment? All three? None? The question drove me half mad with trying to figure it out. When I was finally free, when the war ended and the soldiers came through Georgia telling us we weren't property anymore, I expected to feel pure joy. But what I felt was more complicated. Relief, yes. Hope, yes. But also grief for the childhood I never had. Rage at what was done to me and my mother and my siblings. Confusion about who I even was without that identity as a property. It took me 20 years to make peace with my history. To accept that my father was a monster who created me. To understand that I could honor my mother's sacrifice and suffering without being defined by it. To build a life that was truly my own. I married a good man. We have 3 children. They know their history, I've made sure of that. They know where they came from, what their grandmother endured, what their mother survived. But they also know they're free. That they belong to no one but themselves. That they have opportunities one could never have imagined as a child picking cotton in my father's fields. That's what freedom means. Not forgetting the past, but not being trapped by it either. Building something new. Making sure our children have better than we had. Making sure the world changes so what happened to us can never happen again. I'll never forget my father. But I've made peace with never forgiving him either. Some things are simply beyond forgiveness. And that's okay. I've built a good life anyway. I've found joy anyway. I've created a family where love isn't conditional on ownership, where my children are seen as human beings, not as property. That's my revenge. That's my victory. Living well, living free, making sure my father's legacy dies with his generation, while my mother's legacy, her courage, her endurance, her refusal to be broken, lives on through us. The story of the Crawford plantation raises uncomfortable questions about complicity, about how systems of oppression function, about what it takes to challenge injustice. Crawford himself is an easy villain. His actions were monstrous, his calculations cold, his treatment of his own children indefensible. But Crawford didn't operate in isolation. He existed within a system that enabled and protected him, a legal structure that classified human beings as property, an economic system that profited from their labor, a social structure that looked away from abuses as long as they happened on private property. All the people who knew or suspected what Crawford was doing but said nothing, the neighbors who noticed but didn't speak up, the merchants who conducted business with him, the church members who sat beside him in pews, they were complicit too. Not in the same way Crawford was guilty, but complicit nonetheless in a system that made his actions possible. Charles Dennison was part of that system too, for 20 years, until the day he visited Crawford's plantation and couldn't ignore what he saw any longer. His later actions don't erase his earlier participation in the cotton trade, his earlier profits from enslaved labor. But they do suggest that change is possible, that even people deeply embedded in unjust systems can choose differently when confronted with evidence they can no longer rationalize away. The Underground Railroad network demonstrated what moral courage looks like in practice. Not grand gestures or heroic speeches, but patient, dangerous, unglamorous work. People like Nathan Garrett, Benjamin, Catherine, Margaret, Dr. Preston. They risked everything repeatedly, not for recognition or reward, but because they believed slavery was wrong, and they refused to be bystanders. The 6 people who escaped, Rebecca, Thomas, Ruth, Louisa, Hannah, Abigail, demonstrated different kinds of courage. The courage to hope for something better. The courage to risk death for freedom. The courage to leave behind people they loved because staying meant accepting slavery forever. And the people left behind, Susan who couldn't leave her young children, the other mothers and siblings who remained enslaved, they demonstrated yet another kind of courage. The courage to endure, to survive, to maintain humanity and dignity in a system designed to strip both away. The Crawford case eventually became a footnote in history. One case among thousands, one plantation among tens of thousands, 17 children among millions who were born into slavery. But for the people involved, for the 6 who escaped and the 11 who remained, for the mothers who died and the mothers who survived, for Charles Dennison and Dr. Preston and everyone in the network who helped, it wasn't a footnote. It was their lives, their choices, their moments of courage or complicity or survival. The broader system of slavery continued until the Civil War ended it more than 13 years after the events described here. The structural racism that slavery created persisted long after emancipation, shaping American society for generations. The trauma experienced by enslaved people reverberated through their descendants, creating psychological and economic disadvantages that never fully healed. But individual action still mattered. 6 people lived free because of what Denison and the network accomplished. Their children and grandchildren grew up in freedom. The ripple effects of that one escape, multiplied by thousands of similar escapes facilitated by the Underground Railroad, made a difference that can't be quantified but was real nonetheless. The story of Crawford's Plantation is a story about power and its abuses, about systemic injustice and individual resistance, about the worst aspects of human nature and the best. It's a story that makes us uncomfortable because it forces us to think about complicity, about what we would have done in that time and place, about how we respond to injustice in our own time. It's a story without easy answers, without simple heroes and villains, or rather, with a clear villain in Crawford, but with everyone else existing in moral complexity, making imperfect choices in an impossible situation. It's a story that *happened*. Not a legend, not a myth, but documented history. People lived these events. People suffered, fought, escaped, survived, died. Their lives mattered. Their stories matter. Their choices, for good or ill, shaped the world we inherited. And perhaps that's the real lesson. That history isn't abstract. It's made of individual choices, individual moments of courage or cowardice, individual decisions to challenge injustice or look away. The people in this story weren't fundamentally different from us. They faced their moral tests, their moments of choice. We face ours. How we respond defines who we are, just as their responses defined who they were. The circumstances change, but the fundamental questions remain the same. What do we do when confronted with injustice? When do we stop being complicit? What are we willing to risk for our principles? Who are we willing to help, even at great cost to ourselves? The Crawford Plantation is gone now, long since broken up and sold. The fields where those 17 children worked are planted with different crops or built over with houses. The people are all dead, Crawford, Denison, the escapees, the ones left behind, all buried and gone. But the story remains. A testament to what happened. A reminder of where we came from. A challenge to think about where we're going and what kind of world we're building for our own children and grandchildren. That's why these stories matter. Not because they're comforting, they're not. But because they're true. And truth, however uncomfortable, is always worth preserving. This story shows us that the most horrifying chapters of history aren't about ghosts or supernatural evil. They're about the very real cruelty that humans inflict on each other when systems of power allow them to treat people as property. The Crawford Plantation was real. The 17 children were real. The escapes, the courage, the brutality, the resistance, all of it happened. What do you think of this story? Do you believe you would have had the courage to help like Charles Denison and the Underground Railroad network? Or would you have been one of the many who knew but stayed silent? Leave your honest thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your reflections. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and complicity and courage, hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates deep historical stories that reveal uncomfortable truths. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these important stories that remind us where we came from and why we must never go back. Thank you for listening to this difficult but necessary story. These histories matter. They shape who we are. And remembering them, really remembering them, not sanitizing or simplifying them, is how we honor the people who lived them and ensure we learn from their experiences. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore another hidden chapter of American history that deserves to be told.